All right, moving on to photosynthesis. This will kind of end out our overall metabolism um, discussion. I'm going to attempt to give a brief overview of this whole chapter very quickly. Okay, so we have concept 10.1 photosynthesis converts light energy into chemical energy of food. Point two, the light reactions convert solar energy to the chemical energy of ATP and NADPH. This is very similar to NAD that we've seen before. It just has a phosphate group. Now, there's this thing called the Calvin cycle, which then utilizes this chemical energy to reduce carbon dioxide into sugar. And there are some alternative mechanisms to help this system work in hot, arid climates. Now, this is the figure that you need to know and understand. Okay, so if what I'm going to give you a lot of details here very rapidly. This is what I want you to know and memorize. So here we have light shining into the thylakoids of chloroplasts. This is a membrane-bound structure that will take electrons from water, which will leave oxygen. Those electrons will then be passed on to NADPH. We will also, in the process of passing these electrons through an electron transport chain, we will generate ATP. Both of these can feed into the Calvin cycle, where we take carbon dioxide and start dumping electrons onto it, and that will ultimately produce sugars. Okay. From the Calvin cycle, we have the used NADP plus, again, just an alternative form of NAD plus. It just has a phosphate group, and we have spent ATP that can feed back into here. So you can see how this is cycling here. This is pulling here. So as long as a plant has light, water, and carbon dioxide, it is good to go. All right. So this is what you need to know. So something to understand is that plants are known as autotrophs because they sustain themselves without eating anything else, right? So they are the primary producers in the biosphere. They get organic molecules directly from CO2 and taking things from the environment. Photosynthesis occurs in plants, algae, particular unicellular eukaryotes that aren't called algae, and also a lot of prokaryotes are capable of photosynthesis. Pretty much all plants are photoautotrophs, meaning that they use the energy of sunlight to make organic molecules. Understand autotrophs up here would include microorganisms that are capable of gleaning energy directly from inorganic molecules, such as causing iron to rust, stealing electrons from iron or other materials like that. But plants do this by taking energy from sunlight. This either directly or indirectly drives the entire world, right? So we as heterotrophs get our energy from eating other organisms, be it plant or other animals, and ultimately those animals probably ate plants, right? So we consume all the photoautotrophs. So the photoautotrophs are the foundation of the food web. All right, so chloroplasts are the structures within plants where photosynthesis takes place. They are structurally very similar to photosynthetic bacteria, right? They look like them. They have genes like them. And the structural organization allows photosynthesis to carry out. So let's take a look at a plant. Here we have a plant leaf. That plant leaf has a layer of epithelial cells which separates the inside from the outside of the plant. In there are these things called stomata, which can open and close, letting in carbon dioxide and letting out oxygen. Inside of the leaf, we have various mesophilic cells and vasculature, which can carry nutrients from the leaf to the main part of the tree or plant. If we then zoom in on this mesophilial cell, it is filled with chloroplasts, right? So let's take a look at those chloroplasts. Those chloroplasts have an outer membrane. They then have another inner membrane. In between there, we would call that the inner membrane space. Then inside of all that, we have these stacks of thylakoids called granulum. And these are all an interconnected network of membrane space. So inside of the space, the thylakoid space is all ultimately connected throughout here. And it is separated from the outside via the stoma space. So there's several compartments in here. This is the one we are most concerned with because in the thylakoids is where we find chlorophyll. So if you take a look at photosynthesis, the overall equation is that you take carbon dioxide and water and light energy and you turn it into sugar, oxygen, and water. If you kind of look at this from a different point of view, what we are doing is taking carbon dioxide and we are splitting it. The carbon goes in sugar, and some of the oxygen goes into the sugar as well. All of the hydrogens are coming from water. We are again splitting water that is producing the oxygen, and some of the leftover hydrogens and oxygens from this process actually form a new set of water. Okay. This is also a redox process, right? So here, carbon dioxide is becoming reduced. It is gaining electrons to turn into glucose. Water itself is becoming oxidized or losing electrons, turning into molecular oxygen. This is a two-stage process. So we have light reactions and the Calvin cycle. So light reactions is where we use light energy. Calvin cycle is where we synthesize glucose from carbon dioxide. So light reactions split water, release oxygen, generate NADPH, so it reduces NADP to NADPH, and it also generates ATP through photophosphorylation, okay, which is very similar to the electron transport chain method. It is an electron transport chain method. All right, then we have the Calvin cycle, which occurs in the stroma, so in that space outside of the thylakoids. And this will generate sugar from CO2 utilizing ATP and NADPH. This is a process that we call carbon fixation because it is taking CO2 from the environment and turning it into larger organic molecules. So coming back to that thing that we said you need to know, we have these thylakoids. That's where the light actions occur. Light comes in, water comes in, spent NADP plus and ADP come in. That produces or kind of poops out oxygen as a byproduct, and the electrons split from water are going into the NADPH, and along the way it generates ATP by going through an electron transport chain. This will then feed into the Calvin cycle along with carbon dioxide, which will produce the sugar. Right? So let's take a closer look at just the light reactions. So this is a solar-powered chemical factory of sorts. This is all dependent on sunlight. Again, the details aren't important here, but light is a spectrum that has a wavelength. Shorter wavelength has higher energy. Longer wavelength has lower energy. Red is longer wavelength. Blue and violet are higher wavelength. Okay, so higher energy. So it shouldn't be a surprise to you that UV light or X-rays or gamma rays can actually damage you because they have so much energy associated with it. So the reason why plants are green is out of the visible spectrum, they absorb the blue, they absorb the red. It's pretty much green that doesn't get absorbed. So it appears to us as green. You can measure this through a device called a spectrophotometer. Here we have a white light, shines through a prism, creates a rainbow. We can turn that prism, and then we shine it onto a plate that has a slot, and we can select the color. So here, if we select green, shine it through a tube that has chlorophyll, that light will just pass straight through, and we'll have a meter that says, yep, all the light is making it through. Down here, we have the prism adjusted so it's shining blue light. Chlorophyll can absorb all that blue light. Not very much makes it through, and you can see the meter will drop back down to close to zero. So if you look at the absorption spectrums of chlorophylls and some of the accessory pigments in plants, you can see that they absorb a lot in this area and absorb a lot in this area, but in this green spectrum, they do not absorb much at all. This is chiefly due to this guy here called chlorophyll, which comes in different forms. Chlorophyll absorbs that light energy, and it transfers that light energy onto electrons, which can then become energized. It looks something like this. So we have an electron in chlorophyll, photon comes in, it energizes that electron, it gets into an excited state. It can then be transferred somewhere else, or it can then release that energy in the form of heat and more photons and return back down the ground state. What photosynthesis does is tries to harvest that. So here in a membrane, we have this big photoreceptor complex, which has all these pigment molecules surrounding a central core, which has a pair of chlorophyll molecules. The light comes in, gets absorbed, and then retransmitted, focused in on the chlorophyll, or in the middle. That will then elevate an electron, which then can be passed off onto a reaction center. This is more physically what it looks like in the membrane. This is more cartoonish. All right, you can see these are kind of acting as light antennas of sorts. Right, so photosystem is broken down into two parts, photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. Let's kind of take a look at how this works, just as an overview. Again, you don't need to remember this stuff. We'll pick this part up in the next video.